Thanks very much for that introduction. Now I feel like I have to live up to it. I am, as Dawn said, going to read a bit from each of my books and then finish off with a few new poems. It's sort of an interesting exercise for me to sort of look back at how my work has evolved over time and the different kind of styles in which I've written. I'm going to start with Whitestone, the first book, and the poems in this book are all inspired in some way or another by Alice in Wonderland. There are a number of poems in this collection that are about the historical figure of Alice Liddell, who inspired the character, but I'm going to read only poems about the imagined Alice. And I would say that one of the things that really led me to write poetry was imagination, just that privilege and pleasure of simply making things up, and also just a love of language itself. And so I was interested in the notion of Alice as a written book, and this first poem that I'm going to read sort of plays with that notion of the physical book and the character emerging from it. And I would also say that a lot of my early writing was much more interested in narrative, in storytelling, than my work is these days. So that's one of the things that has shifted in my work over time. Visitor from overseas. I received an envelope from England, somewhat torn, postage £2, cancellation stamped across a queen's face. Inside brown paper, an ironmonger's plastic bag gasped like my childhood rabbit just before it died. Unsealed, Alice crawled out, small and scraggly, arms stuck to her sides, and starved. I had no crumpets, so fed her large Canadian muffins instead, which she nibbled with admirable restraint. Overnight while I slept, she swelled, spurted in height until I woke and found her crouched against the ceiling, learning how to curse. I offered the entire contents of my fridge, but nothing shrank her back again, nothing until I told her she was beautiful, her legs burnished as arbutus limbs. Curious, she reduced herself to door-frame size, followed me to find these trees, a land she'd never seen. There, on a Pacific beach, remembered, rowing under shapely willows with a man 3 times her size, who liked her little, who kept her between pages, sent her wrapped over the Atlantic, so as not to mar the idea of her he kept under glass, scalloped like a fancy cake. So, as I said, these are poems about imagined Alices. In this collection, I wrote a series of portrait poems in which I put Alice alongside various other characters, various other icons, really. Some of them characters, some of them actual people. So I'll read a couple of those. They really began as exercises for myself. When I was working on these poems, I could see Alice anywhere, and it was easy to write poems imagining her in any kinds of context. So there were many poems that were less successful and didn't make it into the book, but these were a few where I felt that there was something compelling for me anyway about the pairing. And this one is Portrait of Alice with Christopher Robin. So, of course, what was compelling in that was the fact of these two real people / fictional characters. So I'm not sure if the characters in the poem are, in fact... They're not really the characters from the books. They're, again, sort of my imagined versions of those characters who are a cross between the historical figures and the characters in the books. Portrait of Alice with Christopher Robin. In the midst of a winter wood, she walks like old age, bent under falling snow and the ghost of her written self, heavy as bundled kindling on her back. At a tree's base, he huddles his narrow shoulders as if lost, his head, familiar from books, hung forward in dangerous chilled sleep, calves downy-haired and goose-bumped past short pants, an italic fall of snowflakes various as dreams across his face. She watches his trembling lips mumble of yellowed bears and bluster and rain, of being irrevocably stuck. Then she presses her hand to his cheek. His lashes flutter. He shows her his eyes made of glaciers and pronounces her name. To the magic flame he makes with 2 rubbed sticks, she gives her pinafore and white socks, the ribbon from her fallen hair. He fumbles with his buttons, burns his trousers and dirty shirt. They point to figures in the smoke, Lumpen bear, white rabbit, honeypot, teacup. Naked together they watch with ash-stung eyes and neither blink nor shiver. This one is Alice and Elvis, really chosen because they're both such iconic figures. I think everyone has an image that's conjured by those two names. But in fact, for me, and I think it's something that a poet would understand, what really led me to this idea was not so much that as just the sound of Alice and Elvis together, that sort of slant rhyme and the similarity in the appearance of the names on the page. So this is Portrait of Alice with Elvis. Queen and king, they rule side by side in golden thrones above the clouds. Her giggle and wide eyes remind him of his first young wife, and his twang never ceases to thrill her, so different from the prim accents of men she's known. She sings for him, Hound Dog and Heartbreak Hotel, and he turns the mock turtle's song of beautiful soup campier with each performance, hip twists till her eyes stream and she melts with laughter. Sometimes they leave their airy realm to share a strawberry shake at Burger King in Memphis, visit the Tate Gallery in London solemnly to ponder the Lady of Shalott alone and adrift in her rowboat. In rare arguments over fame, he cites the churches of Elvis, the Vegas tributes, while she mentions the Alice shop in Oxford, the Alice ride at Disneyland. He says more books have been written about him, but she insists hers are of higher caliber. Her words are quoted much more often than his. He calls up wax figures, she teapots, and tarot cards. Both delight in their limited edition collector's plates. For dinner, they fry chicken, make tea and scones, tarts filled with his favorite, peanut butter. He runs her a lavender bubble bath, washes her hair, greases his own. She lays her head against his chest during late-night TV, murmurs of the man who gave her fame, and he of the woman for whom he won his. She wants to sway to the beat of his heart in her ear, slow as Are You Lonesome Tonight? In sleep, their tear-blotched faces could be anyone's. I'll read two more from Whitestone. These are also portrait poems, although they're Portrait of Alice as rather than Portrait of Alice with. So these are more metaphorically inclined. Portrait of Alice as an English landscape. At first, you were a verdant field, your hips slight as the rise and fall of hills. Soon you swelled, were covered in a tight checkered dress. The landscape divided into a game of chess, each square set with church steeple, oak tree, queen. The world played other games upon you, sank deep holes into your feet, hid its trash in the pit beneath your arm. By the end, you are that crone, it's said all women become, wizened and wise, cracked lake beds where your eyes were. Portrait of Alice as spirit. Once the moon cast your shadow, and you saw yourself complete, your body defined black on the night pavement as if it belonged as much as the grasses and yews. That was a long time ago. Now you envy the ease with which others cast shadows, the cat brushing against her own evidence of being in the dim hallway, the lily scrolling itself black against the white wall. The stone lays its shape down with such assurance you could weep. So I will move from there to 2 Bowls of Milk. A number of the poems in this book were written concurrently with the poems in Whitestone. As you can imagine, I sometimes needed a break from Alice. So there were other poems that arose in the process. And these, as I was suggesting, were much less narrative-driven and much more image-driven. This one is the first poem in the book, and it got its momentum from its first line, which I borrowed from the poet John Ashbery. I find it's often useful to take lines from other writers. Often in the revision process, that initiating line falls away, and my own poem has emerged from it. But in this case, I really needed to retain that initial line. But it's just a way of inhabiting a different voice. And in this poem, Ashbery's line, which is "Come to the edge of the barn, the property really begins there," promised both a sense of exploration and also given that it's quite a lengthy line, it gave my poem a lengthy line as well, and a kind of cumulative syntax. So it's written in a much less clipped style than some of my other poems. Come to the edge of the barn, the property really begins there. You see things defining themselves, the hoof prints left by sheep, the slope of the roof, each feather against each feather on each goose. You see the stake with the flap of orange plastic that marks the beginning of real. I'm showing you this because I'm sick of the way you clutch the darkness with your hands, seek invisible fence posts for guidance, accost specters. I'm coming with you because I fear you'll trip over the string that marks the beginning. You'll lie across the border, and with that view, fields of intricate grain and chiseled mountains, cold winds already lifting the hairs of your arm, you'll forget your feet, numb in straw, and be unable to rise, to walk farther. My fingers weave so close between yours because I've been there before. I know the relief of everything, how it eases the mind to learn shapes it hasn't made, how it eases the feet to know the ground will persist. See those 2 bowls of milk, just there on the other side of the property line, there for the cats that sometimes cross over and are seized by a thirst, there to wash your hands in. Lick each finger afterwards. That will be your first taste, and my finger tracing your lips will be the second. I suppose so. Thank you. Thank you. This next one was written at around the same time, and it also sort of began as an exercise for myself. It was early September in Vancouver when there were still blackberries growing from every place where blackberry bushes grew, which meant almost everywhere, any kind of vacant lot, they were just there. So I was interested in that sense of abundance, and also thinking about other writers who've written about blackberries, such as Sylvia Plath or Francis Ponge, for example. And so my poem arose not so much out of direct response to any of theirs as just to the notion of blackberries as inspiration. Many have written poems about blackberries, but few have gotten at the multiplicity of them. How each berry composes itself of many dark notes, spherical, swollen, fragile as a world. A blackberry is the color of a painful bruise on the upper arm, some internal organ as yet unnamed. It is shaped to fit the tip of the tongue, to be a thimble, a dunce cap for a small mouse. Sometimes it is home to a secret green worm seeking safety and the power of surprise. Sometimes it plunks into a river and takes on water. Fishes nibble it. The bushes themselves ramble like a grandmother's sentences, giving birth to their own sharpness. Picking the berries must be a tactful conversation of gloved hands. Otherwise your fingers will bleed the berry's purple tongue. Otherwise thorns will pierce your own blank skin. Best to be on the safe side, the outside of the bush. Inside might lurk nests of yellow jackets, rabid bats, other larger hands on the same search. The flavor is its own reward, like kissing the whole world at once, rivers, willows, bugs, and all, until your swollen lips tingle. It's like waking up to discover the language you used to speak is gibberish and you have never really loved. But this does not matter, because you have married this fruit, mellifluous, brutal, and ripe. This one is still very metaphorically driven, but more focused, I would say. In Blackberries, I was trying to look at, trying to figure out how many different ways one could see blackberries. And this poem is the antithesis of that, in that the metaphors are implied, or I'm attempting to resist the metaphors, and the metaphors still keep cropping up. This is 2 bowls of milk. Are 2 bowls of milk. They are round and white and have nothing to do with the moon. They have no implications of blindness or sight. They wait on the doorstep like bowls, or like things that closely resemble bowls in their stillness. The bowls do not foreshadow cats. There are 2 because 2 hands set them out and each wanted to hold something. Milk because not water. the curve of milk against the curve of bowl. I'm going to read two more poems from this book. These were poems that were written while I was living in Ottawa and while I was making regular visits to the National Gallery and taking notes on what I saw and then coming home and writing poems drawn from that. So this one is called Dog Woman. It's about a very small sculpture in the Inuit collection, which I believe is still in the basement of the gallery, which is both a little unfortunate in that a lot of people don't make their way down there, but fortunate for the people who do, because it's a very quiet place and one can spend a lot of time comparatively alone there, contemplating the work. Dog Woman. Who's to say I'm not that dog? That small woman low to ground and wrought of greenish stone, packed inside the flaccid palm of who I think I am. Snow and blue ice, song of a woman cutting excess from a rock she found. She kept it warm a long time in her fist, the idea of Dog Woman hardening to bone, barking hot. It took her a week, ice cracked, her kids cried for meat. Now Dog Woman lives in a glass case in a basement where a girl's paid to wear a suit and watch that no one steals her. I come on Fridays. That girl and I have nearly melted the glass with our breath, waiting for animal speech. In silence, Dog Woman's replete, unleashed. And one of the things that I was trying to do in writing these poems was in some way capture in poetry the style of the artwork that had inspired the piece. So in that poem, I was trying to use relatively spare, accessible, clean language. This next poem is a prose poem written in response to a small installation by Joseph Cornell called the Hotel Eden, which those of you who spend time regularly in the gallery have probably seen. It's sort of a little box with various found objects and a little cutout parrot and various words written in there. So a lot of the images that show up in the poem are there in the image itself. And I think in my style in this poem, I was somewhat inspired by the poet Charles Simic, who had written, or has written, a really wonderful book called, now I've suddenly forgotten the name of it. I was going to say Alchemy of Dreams, but I don't think it's that. It will come to me later, but a book of poems about Joseph Cornell's work. So there's a sort of surrealism here that comes both from Simic and from the installation itself. This is called Waiting Room. Mornings, a green parrot pronounces children's names in French. This room is white, and past the glass a clutch of palm trees waves hello, goodbye. Then there's the sea. I watch it froth. I push that yellow ball across the floor beneath my foot. It puts a good hurt somewhere in my throat. I've read the bodies made of bits that link in unexpected ways, and this is one. When I say the parrot's name, he tugs a string to start the music box. Stars twinkle, twinkle as song pricks a metal fingertip. There is no blood. My mother sang that, twinkle, very far away. She's even farther now, and still I find her voice inside my mouth as I address the box I painted shut. It's not too late to fill it with an infant, little protuberance from my gut. But I have my bird and chair and music, water always moving out. I have the song my mother passed along and cannot give it ever up. So, and I just remembered the title of the book, Dime Store Alchemy. I would recommend it highly. So now I'll read a few poems from my most recent book, although, as Don said, it's not that recent. It came out in 2000, I'm embarrassed to say, a long time ago now. And this first poem is the first poem in the book, and I think it's pretty self-explanatory. It drew its energy from the sort of cumulative syntax of the child's rhyme, The House That Jack Built, which was one of my favorites as a child. I love the way it just continued unscrolling. This is called Window. This is the window I grew up inside. This is a Japanese maple that grew beyond it and still does, obscuring the view. It is the view. These are the leaves of the Japanese split-leafed maple, red except when autumn puckers them to rust. This is the glass. Between branches, the small patch of lawn we owned, and the sidewalk, and the house across the street, and farther houses. Fogged in winter, it made ethereal the place I didn't call suburb until after it took 3 hours for the boat to circle Manhattan. The frame of the retina cracked. When I returned, the view had flattened to a stamp. This is the stamp I kept when I left, the stamp to which I sent my letters, stuck every night under eyelids. These are the roots that extend from the tree outside the window I grew up inside. When I left, they kept on growing into the foundations. This is another home poem, but in this one I was trying to pare the sentences down as much as possible in a sort of echoing of what's going on in the poem, which is an attempt to take the room that I grew up in back through its various generations. Room. Not really there yet. Peel back latex to find the wild rose paper underneath. Pin-ups appear there, men whose lips urge my lips toward their sheen. Their faces fall away. Posters of kittens come and go. Unchosen, each glued sheet loosens, leaves a stretch of pink. Print small hands across it, trying out edges. That color, the world entire. A brush retracts it. Yellow walls, ungendered. Someone else's objects gather. Now the walls are boards with gaps. Now gaps, and now a forest encloses. Who knows where it goes? This is another poem about a room. This was inspired by visiting the Anne Frank house in Amsterdam, and thinking back to my experience reading the Diary of Anne Frank as a child, and my sort of horror and fascination with that enclosed existence in that hidden space. So in this poem as well, I was trying to pare down the story as much as possible so that only the essence was here. I'm still not sure whether I've pared away too much. I'm not sure, that is to say, how comprehensible the poem actually is to someone who doesn't already know Anne Frank's story. But in any case, it's called Akhter Host, which I'm probably mispronouncing. But that's essentially means sort of the house after the house, or the house behind the house. And Westerkerk is the church that was very close by. Akhter Host. Into the house, behind the chime of Westerkerk. She learns silence as though reverent, makes room when others enter, reads each floorboard, writes it again until truth emerges. Less room until only her clothes. After, pages. Then a door opens. On a TV screen, her father confesses he hadn't known that Anne. Beyond the blackout curtains, the garden has grown up, of course. What if there had been another room? We lived there. And this is another poem that's sort of composed of found pieces, found in a different sense, more literally in this sense, because I put this poem together from quotations drawn from two books. One is Masterpieces from the Great Dutch Museums, and the other is a book called Vermeer of Delft. I've written a number of poems about Vermeer paintings, and so these are quotes that were all in some way preoccupied with the notion of absence, or with the suggestion of something that was missing, or something that could not be fully understood. And so it was inspired by that actual material, and also by my experience of going to Delft and wanting to see the actual scenes that Vermeer had painted, and feeling a kind of frustration at the fact that those scenes had probably never existed, which is to say that as realistic as his paintings seem, it may be the case that he actually imagined a lot of the streetscapes and the scenes that he painted. So this is called What Was Lost. The old quarters of Delft no longer contain the little facades which Vermeer depicted. The painting does not seem to have any particular meaning. Possibly many perished in the explosion which in 1654 destroyed a whole district of Delft. What the game is, we cannot see. Against the house to the left, of which we can only see half, grows a vine. This can no longer be traced. It seems hard to connect it. One cannot see the windows. Old maps show that there were never two archways side by side on this spot. The painting is signed at the top but not dated. It then disappears from view. It is not known who this girl was. I'll read one more from Pavilion and then just a couple of more recent poems. Let me see. I'll read this one called August. This is another poem that I wrote while I was living in Ottawa, in Vanier, not too far from here. August. Just 10 a.m., already those kids screaming as they play behind the house. Their day is an endless thing, and they're only running their hands along the head so far. It has smooth teeth. Out front, the blue car waits for you to use it, though you doubt there is a destination. Last night, the sunset was spectacular. Your friends whooped, and one, carried away, shouted, "Author, author!" You dreamt a death you hadn't known would seize your chest. Whose was it now? Earlier this morning, too early in the season, the wind bit. You shut the window. These shrieks come from the same kids who scuttled in snowsuits, though this winter, a week ago you would have called it next, the snowsuits won't fit. Though it's slow and fallen into rust, the blue car is called a sprint. So in writing that one, I found that the use of the second person gave it a kind of coolness in the tone that I felt was necessary to sort of counteract the melancholy preoccupation with the passage of time, which shows up in a lot of my writing. And so I'm going to read another poem that also that has that same kind of preoccupation, although there is a first person in this one. This was actually published in Arc magazine, so I thought I'd read it because of that Ottawa connection. It was they were doing a special issue of Arc for Arc's 30th anniversary, so they were requesting poems that in some way tied to the notion of 30. So this is a poem called Remembering 30. Between then and now, a random newborn grew, stood, walked, was left with someone else a few hours and then longer, got a hook and cubbyhole, discovered that cheddar's better grated, played soccer in a long shirt by the lake, begged for a rabbit, mastered several high-tech gadgets, preferred red, had a crush, got a rabbit, endured regular haircuts. No envelope sealed the evidence. Snow fell and melted, and each time the leaves' opening seemed impossible, the leaves opened. Last night I dreamt my face lined and sanded as the face of my aunt when she still knew who we were. In her wedding photos, she looked like Katharine Hepburn, young. When her daughter turns away, she stuffs a Christmas orange whole into her mouth. Yes, even the peel. These three more recent ones that I'm closing with, I chose them just for their contrast in styles, where that last one I would say was relatively accessible and almost confessional in the way that it was structured. A lot of the poems that I've been writing have been more interested in juxtapositions of ideas and images, and also I've been writing a lot of poems about zoos, so I've been interested in these sort of strange, part natural, part artificial environments. And this particular one, which is called Song for the Song of the Aviary, borrows the syntax of its title from Don Mackay, who has written a series of poems called Song for the Song of. So again, I have to acknowledge that inspiration. And this one I would say was led more by its sound than by the syntax or than the imagery, really. It's one of those rare poems that was very, very quick to write, and I didn't meddle with it very much afterwards. Song for the Song of the Aviary. Echoes close at hand, as in a can. Plastic tassels hang. Beyond, an expanse, a mesh sky, shit of the raucous. Flamingos mum, gulls famished for fries. The whiff of a colony of cormorants on cliffs near the first narrows, a dizzying tilt of the head to gauge just how far it goes. Here, not far. Decades of the pent, the bent-necked. Maybe they're happy. Fish in dishes, paste smeared in a tray, a shallow basin, many hills, such surfaces, sand, creak of rocks, brick path, shrubs, a grand snag. The air is real, rainy at times to wash it cleanish. At the other end, another door. And before I read the last poem, I'd just like to thank everyone at Tree for giving me such a warm welcome. I was really pleased to be invited back to Ottawa to read here, and like to thank all of you for coming as well, and to thank everyone who read at the open set and who will read, because it takes courage to get up here and read one's work, and I really appreciate that, being part of that conversation as an audience member tonight. So this poem is... it actually was drawn from a dream, which is rare for me, and it's written in a series of unconnected individual lines. So I was sort of interested, again, as I was saying, in sort of juxtapositions and an associative way of proceeding through the poem. Life of the mind, night. Yes, this vessel outstreams fate. This might be the Nile or another mouth. We gather on the deck between above and under, all the unimagined constellations. The steamer forges. Blue goes the owl and the ticking bats, churning where the river meets the sea. The votive dragon, phoenix stitched of silk and not of fire on the water locomotive, and the dog star and the Isle of Dogs, and heaven upon the waters. Thanks very much.